Chin cuts off the 4 heavy legs of the boar, each weighing more than 10 kilograms. Looking at the meat, he thinks that this supply could last them quite a long time. However, he quickly realizes that carrying everything alone will be impossible. Even so, he refuses to bring Helen with him into the grove, worrying that the area might still be dangerous. Back at the camp, Helen has been busy with her own tasks. She finds a large, sturdy fishbone and begins sharpening it carefully against a stone. After working patiently for a while, she manages to create a sharp and durable needle-like tool. It might prove useful for sewing or crafting other necessary items. Suddenly, Chin quietly sneaks up behind her and casually comments that her needle looks pretty good. His voice appears so unexpectedly that it startles her badly. Helen jumps in fright and accidentally pricks her finger with the needle. Clearly annoyed, she turns toward him and angrily tells him never to scare her like that again. A little later, Helen notices the 4 massive boar legs Chin brought back with him. Her eyes instantly light up with excitement. For the first time in a while, she realizes they will be able to eat real meat. Chin believes that if they use the meat carefully and do not waste any of it, the supply could last them for at least half a month, maybe even longer. As she inspects the meat more closely, Helen notices a thick white layer and asks Chin what that strange fatty part is called. Chin explains that it is boar fat. If they melt it properly, they can produce something similar to cooking oil or butter, which will be very useful for preparing food. Helen looks doubtful and points out that they do not have any proper containers to store such things. She wonders how they would keep the fat once it is melted. Chin laughs lightly and says the solution is simple. They will just have to make their own containers. With a playful smile, he invites Helen to help him experiment with clay. Chin begins kneading the soft clay they found near their camp and explains that he will show her how to make basic pottery. The clay here is surprisingly rich and smooth, making it ideal for crafting utensils. The Field Crafts pack he once purchased from the system's online store contains instructions for 6 different clay working techniques. After considering them briefly, Chin decides to try one of the simpler methods. He explains that depending on what item you want to create, you first roll the clay into long rope-like strands. These strands will later form the structure of the dish. Chin carefully coils the clay ropes around a small base he already shaped, stacking them one on top of another to gradually form the walls of a container. He adds that there are many other ways to shape pottery, but most professional methods require a pottery wheel. For beginners, and especially in their survival situation, those techniques would be far too complicated. After finishing the basic structure, Chin proudly shows the clay vessel to Helen and says it is almost complete. All that remains is to smooth the surface and give it its final shape. But the moment Helen sees it, she bursts into laughter. The clay object looks suspiciously like a giant pile of excrement. Her reaction deeply offends Chin, who immediately becomes irritated and throws the clay aside. Defensively, he explains that the clay is extremely soft, which is why it lost its proper form while he was shaping it. Chin then challenges Helen to try making something herself using the same technique. That way, he says, she will understand how difficult pottery actually is. Determined to prove his point, Chin begins crafting a small cup. He carefully shapes it, concentrating on every detail. When he finishes, he proudly examines the result and believes it turned out perfectly. Showing the cup to Helen, Chin confidently boasts about his work. He adds that mastering any skill simply requires practice and experience. Helen quietly mentions that she has already made several clay pieces herself, although she still feels they are not very good. When Chin looks at them, however, he is stunned. Her bowls have nearly perfect shapes, as if they were crafted by an experienced artisan. Chin sincerely praises her talent and suggests she try making something more complex, like a cooking pot. He carefully places the finished bowls outside to dry and then asks Helen to attempt making a medium-sized pot, which will be easier to fire later. Meanwhile, Chin grabs a bamboo stick and begins digging a hole that will serve as the base for a small kiln. Although clay can be fired directly over a fire, he believes building a proper oven will produce much better results. After working for a while, he successfully digs a pit deep enough to function as the foundation for their kiln and begins assembling the structure that will allow them to fire their pottery. Inside the pit, Chin reinforces the walls to keep the structure stable. Above it, he builds the upper part of the kiln, shaping it into a box-like form suitable for firing clay vessels. Time passes quickly while they focus on their work. By the time the sun begins to set, Chin realizes that they will have to continue building the kiln tomorrow. The two survivors sit together beside their small fire, quietly enjoying their simple dinner. As Chin chews his food, he reflects on how their situation has slowly begun to improve. With the new fish trap working well, they now have enough fish to last at least a full day, maybe even longer. On top of that, the large pieces of boar meat they brought back give them even more security. Helen notices that Chin is smiling to himself for no obvious reason. Curious about what could have put him in such a good mood, she asks him what he is thinking about and why he suddenly seems so happy. Chin casually shrugs and says that it was probably just some random, meaningless thought. He claims he cannot even remember what made him smile in the first place, brushing the question off lightly. In truth, Chin is hiding his real thoughts. As he pulls on the t-shirt Helen repaired for him, he silently reflects that the real reason for his smile is simple: they are still alive. On an island like this, just surviving another day already feels like a victory worth celebrating. While adjusting the shirt, he carefully looks at the clean, tight stitching Helen used to repair it. The neatness of the work impresses him. In a world where most people rarely sew anything themselves, someone with such skill feels surprisingly rare. Helen, however, speaks with a serious tone. She reminds him that they must take very good care of their clothes because they have no replacements. Eventually, the fabric will wear out no matter how often she repairs it. She admits that even though she tries her best to fix everything, she fears there may come a day when her sewing will no longer be enough. Seeing the worry in her expression, Chin gently reassures her. He tells Helen not to stress about it too much and confidently says that someday they will find a way to change their situation. He speaks firmly, hoping his optimism will give her some hope. After finishing his meal, Chin picks up a small twig and begins cleaning his teeth with it, carefully rubbing between them. Helen watches this with obvious surprise. She has never seen someone clean their teeth like that before, especially using ash instead of toothpaste. Chin explains that the ash actually works quite well for cleaning teeth. It contains alkaline substances like potassium hydroxide, which can help remove plaque and keep the teeth clean. Helen admits that the method still feels very strange and complicated to her. However, she agrees that under their current circumstances, it is far better than doing nothing at all. Soon after, the two of them begin placing their clay creations inside the kiln. As they carefully arrange the bowls and pots, Helen wonders out loud how long the firing process will take. Chin studies the size of the pieces and estimates that firing them properly will require at least 5 hours. He tells her they will have to be patient and wait. Pottery, he explains, is not as simple as it might look. The temperature must be watched closely during the entire process. If it becomes too hot or too cold, the clay can easily crack or chip. Because of that risk, Chin insists that they produce several extra pots and bowls. That way, even if some of them break during firing, they will still have usable ones left. He asks Helen to stay near the kiln and carefully maintain the fire so the temperature remains steady. A stable heat will give them the best chance of avoiding damage. 5 long hours later, the firing process finally ends. Unfortunately, when they examine the results, their excitement fades. Nearly 60% of the bowls have cracked during the process. Chin considers the result disappointing. However, instead of giving up, he immediately begins thinking about ways to improve the success rate next time. He wonders if adjusting the mixture of materials might make the clay stronger. Helen notices one pot that looks slightly different from the others and asks what he did to it. Chin explains that he tried a special technique, mixing fine ceramic powder into the clay to strengthen it. Chin eventually tells Helen it is his turn to stay awake and keep watch. But the girl is still deeply focused on her pottery work and refuses to stop. She insists on finishing the last pot, showing remarkable determination. Watching her work, Chin realizes she seems to have a natural talent for this craft. When the next firing cycle finishes, the results are much better. Only 2 cups break this time. Compared with their first attempt, the improvement is obvious. Chin believes that if they can maintain an even temperature throughout the entire process, the number of broken pieces will decrease even further. By the end of the day, they might have enough usable dishes for everyday use. The next morning arrives. Helen watches Chin preparing something over the fire and asks why he is pouring water into the pot containing melted boar fat. Chin explains that adding water will help separate and produce more fat during the rendering process. It also prevents the fat from burning, making the process much more efficient. While the fat slowly melts, he suggests that Helen crush the shells they collected earlier into a fine powder. Helen looks puzzled and asks why they would need shell powder. She is genuinely surprised when Chin tells her that he plans to make soap. The moment she hears this, her face lights up with excitement. The idea that they might finally be able to wash themselves properly fills her with joy. Chin explains that when boar fat is mixed with alkaline substances, a chemical process called saponification occurs. This reaction allows them to produce soap. Helen says she remembers learning about something similar during chemistry class, though she never imagined she would one day have to use that knowledge just to survive. Together, they begin grinding the shells into powder. The crushed shells contain calcium carbonate, which is necessary for producing the alkaline material they need. When heated in the fire, the calcium carbonate changes into calcium oxide. This substance will play an important role in the process they are attempting. At one point, Helen accidentally inhales some of the fumes produced during heating. The process releases carbon dioxide gas, which can be unpleasant to breathe in. Chin quickly reassures her that the amount released is very small and not dangerous in such an open space. He continues the process, adding water to convert the oxide into calcium hydroxide. Afterward, they combine this mixture with potassium extracted from wood ash, continuing their experiment. Potassium is an alkaline element, and when mixed with fat it reacts to form soap. That simple chemical reaction is exactly what they are trying to achieve. Chin explains that this is not just about cleanliness. There is no medicine on this island, and if they become sick, their chances of survival would be very low. Soap will help them reduce the risk of infection. As the fat melts over the fire, Helen notices the rich smell and comments that it actually smells quite delicious. The aroma reminds her of cooking back home. Chin laughs and tells her that he already has some crispy boar cracklings in his cup. He jokingly adds that while many people love this kind of snack, others might find it unpleasant. After that, he pours the prepared mixture into a large bowl, allowing it to cool and harden into soap. Later, Chin decides he should visit the nearby banana grove before evening. He wants to gather large leaves that can help them prepare for the coming rain. Dark clouds have already begun gathering across the sky. Expecting a heavy storm, Chin uses a bamboo stick to dig a trench around their shelter. The small ditch will help redirect rainwater away from their camp. As he works, he realizes how lucky they were to build a canopy earlier. For crafting pottery and producing soap, Chin receives several thousand additional points in his virtual system account. Curious, he opens the holographic screen and checks the balance. Helen notices him moving his hand strangely in the air, as if he were touching something invisible. She finds the behavior rather unusual, but chooses not to ask about it. Instead, she picks up the newly made soap and tests it with water. It produces a decent foam, though she notices it might dry out her hair if used too often. Chin then hands her a small wooden comb he crafted earlier and says she will probably find it useful. He also reminds Helen that they should quickly store the boar meat and hide the animal skin before the rain arrives. If the supplies get soaked, they might spoil. Once that is done, Chin begins preparing materials to craft a bow. He examines the bamboo carefully and decides that although it is not perfect, it should still work. Knowing that bows can be either light or heavy, Chin decides to build a heavy one. Only a stronger bow will have enough power to hunt animals as large as wild boars. Because the bamboo itself is not strong enough, he decides to create a composite bow. He cuts several thin strips and carefully binds them together to strengthen the structure. However, Chin soon realizes that making a bow is far more complicated than he expected. After working for hours, he has only managed to finish 2 parts of the structure. As evening approaches, enormous dark clouds gather above the island. The sky grows dim, and distant thunder rolls across the horizon, warning that a powerful storm is on its way. Helen glances uneasily at the sky, her brows tightening as the clouds gather and darken above them. A nervous feeling creeps into her voice as she tells the guy that the sky looks heavy and swollen with rain, and she's almost certain a serious downpour is coming soon. The air feels thick and restless, and the distant rumble of thunder only makes her worry grow stronger. CH immediately reacts without wasting a second. Understanding how quickly rain could ruin their supplies, he hurriedly stuffs the meat and the precious soap into the cooking pots. After placing them carefully inside, he presses the lids down tightly, hoping the containers will shield their valuable items from the incoming storm. Once they are satisfied that their food and supplies are safely hidden, the two retreat into their simple shelter. The wind outside grows louder, carrying the scent of wet earth. As they prepare themselves for the approaching storm, Helen quietly asks how long the rain might last, her voice filled with uncertainty. The guy studies the dark sky and listens to the rising wind before answering. He says the rain might be even heavier than they expect, possibly turning into a relentless downpour that could last an entire day without stopping. His words make the situation feel far more serious. In the middle of the night, Chin suddenly jolts awake from his sleep. At first he hears the steady drumming of rain on the shelter, but then something else reaches his ears. Mixed with the rainfall are strange, unfamiliar noises coming from the darkness outside, sounds that immediately put him on edge. A sharp wave of anxiety rushes through him. His instincts, sharpened by survival, tell him that those unusual sounds are not random at all. In an instant, he begins to suspect what kind of creatures might be moving through the night, and the realization sends a chill through his body. Without hesitation, the guy quickly shakes Helen by the shoulders, trying to wake her as fast as possible. His voice is urgent and tense as he tells her to wake up immediately. Something dangerous might be nearby, and they cannot afford to waste even a moment. Helen wakes up abruptly, still half confused and groggy from sleep. She asks what is happening, but Chin cuts her off quickly. He tells her there's no time for explanations and that the canopy must be taken down right away before things get worse. The girl looks completely puzzled, struggling to understand the sudden panic. She keeps asking what exactly is going on. The young man admits he is not completely certain yet, but his instincts tell him they could be in serious danger. Without delaying any longer, they rush toward the nearest large tree. The ground is slick with rain and mud as they run. Chin quickly helps Helen climb up the trunk, guiding her carefully so she can hide high among the branches away from whatever threat might be approaching. Even while climbing, Helen continues whispering confused questions. None of this makes sense to her yet. Chin, however, firmly tells her to stop talking at once and remain completely silent. Any unnecessary noise could reveal their position. Moments later, the forest suddenly erupts with movement. A massive deer bursts into the clearing where their camp once stood. Its hooves pound against the wet ground as it runs wildly, and behind it comes a chaotic swarm of frightened hares racing through the grass. Seeing the animals, Helen lets out a quiet breath of relief and whispers that the guy scared her for nothing. To her, these creatures look harmless, just ordinary animals running through the forest. But Chin's instincts were right after all. Only seconds later, the real danger appears. A huge pack of furious wild boars storms into the clearing, charging forward with heavy snorts and angry grunts as they chase after the fleeing animals. Helen's eyes widen in shock, and she instinctively gasps. Before she can make another sound, Chin quickly covers her mouth with his hand. He holds it there firmly, making sure she stays silent so the enraged boars do not notice them hiding above. From their perch in the tree, Chin carefully counts the animals below. There are around 20 large boars, their massive bodies moving restlessly through the clearing. He quietly reassures Helen that they should stay calm because the animals cannot climb trees. Luckily for them, the rain begins falling even harder. The heavy downpour washes away the scent trail that might have led the boars to their hiding place. Because of the rain, the animals are unable to smell the humans above them. Several of the boars collapse near the base of a tree. The guy watches them carefully, trying to understand what is happening. He cannot tell if the animals are truly dead or if they are pretending to be lifeless, just like the strange boar they encountered earlier. Chai studies the fallen animals more closely and notices something disturbing. There are unusual wounds scattered across their bodies. The injuries look strange and unnatural, making him wonder what kind of creature could have caused them. Meanwhile, the temperature begins dropping quickly as the rain continues pouring down. The cold wind cuts through the wet night air, and if the weather stays like this for much longer, the two young survivors could easily become chilled and sick. Chin realizes they cannot simply sit there forever waiting. Instead of remaining trapped in the tree, he decides to take action. His plan is simple but risky. He will throw his boot down at the boars to scare them away. If they run off, they can finally climb down safely. The guy quietly hopes that this plan will actually work. If the animals refuse to leave, then he might have no choice but to climb down and confront them directly, something he would much rather avoid. When the boot suddenly flies down and hits the ground, the noise immediately grabs the attention of the wild boars. Startled by the unexpected object, the animals jerk upright and begin looking around nervously. To their surprise, the trick actually works. Frightened and confused by the sudden disturbance, the wild boars quickly scatter and run away from the clearing, disappearing back into the dark forest. Helen watches them disappear and whispers that the animals themselves look terrified. She wonders aloud what could possibly have frightened such powerful creatures enough to make them flee like that. Now that the danger seems gone, it is time to climb down. However, Helen hesitates because she is afraid of heights and does not dare jump from the tree. Shin encourages her firmly and tells her to trust him, promising that he will catch her. Shin reassures her again, explaining that the height is only a few meters and that she has nothing to fear. He spreads his arms below, ready to support her if she slips. As Helen carefully moves along the wet branch, her foot suddenly slips on the slick bark. With a frightened scream, she loses her balance and falls straight down toward the guy. Kin tries to catch her, but the force of the fall knocks him off his feet. They both crash onto the ground together, with Helen landing on top of him. In the chaos, she bumps her forehead and winces in pain. After the storm passes, the young survivors begin rebuilding their camp. Helen remarks that dismantling the shelter earlier was actually the right decision. If it had remained standing, the rampaging boars would have surely trampled everything. Helen then walks over to check the cage where the young hares are kept. Relief spreads across her face when she sees they are unharmed. She happily notes that the little animals survived the chaos safely. Her attention then shifts to the small piece of soap in the guy's hands. The constant rain has turned it into a soft, mushy lump. Helen sighs in disappointment because they barely even had the chance to use it before it was ruined. Looking around the camp, they notice that all of their collected firewood has become completely soaked from the rain. The guy hopes the sunlight will soon return so the wood can dry out quickly. Shin walks up to Helen and suddenly tells her that she needs to take off her wet clothes. His words immediately shock and embarrass her, and she stares at him with wide, startled eyes. Chyn quickly explains his reasoning before she misunderstands him. If she keeps wearing those wet clothes, she could easily get sick. She must dry them as soon as possible to stay healthy. Shin then walks toward the nearby stream and observes how dramatically the water level has risen after the storm. Watching the rushing water, he realizes they were lucky not to build their camp too close to it. The fish trap he had originally built from stones is now completely submerged by the swollen stream. However, the newer trap he constructed earlier appears to have survived the flooding without damage. Seeing that things are slowly settling down, the guy decides it is finally time to wash himself and his clothes. He plans to use the remaining bit of soap while it is still usable. Later, the two sit near the fire, drying their clothes and warming their bodies after the cold rain. Helen quietly asks if the wild boars might return again someday. Hein answers thoughtfully that they must always be ready for such possibilities. Because of that, they should continue taking turns standing watch at night. He also believes they need better tools for defense. Instead of running from danger every time, they should make a bow and arrows as soon as possible so they can protect themselves. The guy begins crafting the bow carefully. He ties two curved wooden pieces together with rope and slowly twists them, trying to press the parts tightly so they form a strong and reliable frame. Once the main structure is secure, he binds the pieces even tighter and strengthens the bow by attaching another strip of bamboo along the frame, giving it greater durability. For the bowstring, Shin uses tough boar sinew. Before using it, he plans to dry the sinew properly under the sun so it will maintain both flexibility and strength. After testing the weapon, the guy feels quite satisfied with his work. The string holds firm without snapping, and the bow itself does not bend out of shape. This means the weapon is nearly ready. Ideally, the best wood for making arrows would come from the deciduous alia tree, which provides straight and balanced shafts. Unfortunately, that tree does not grow in this area. Because of that, the guy has no choice but to rely on whatever materials he can find nearby in the forest. The wooden shafts they gathered are still very wet from the rain. To make them stronger and lighter, he carefully places them near the fire so they can dry thoroughly. There are two common ways to create arrowheads. The first method is simple. Heat the tip of the wooden shaft in the fire and then carve it into a hardened sharp point. The second method requires more effort. A sharp stone must be shaped carefully and then inserted into the end of the arrow shaft. After that, it is tied tightly with strong fibers to secure the structure firmly in place. The second method clearly requires much more effort and preparation. Shin decides that before committing to one technique, he will first craft 3 arrows with carefully shaped stone tips and test how powerful they are when fired. If the difference in performance between stone-tipped arrows and simple wooden ones is not significant, he plans to save time and effort by using wooden arrows instead. Just as he finishes preparing his equipment, the familiar virtual system suddenly activates. A calm mechanical voice informs him that he has received a reward of 2,000 points for successfully crafting a bow and arrows. The unexpected bonus catches him off guard, and for a moment he stands there pleasantly surprised. Curious about his progress, Shin quickly checks his accumulated points. After counting them carefully, he realizes that his balance has already exceeded 11,000 points. This amount is significant enough to allow him to purchase one of the more expensive skill packs available in the system. He begins thinking carefully about which ability would help him most. Once before, he used a skill called Cheetah Speed, and that burst of speed had literally saved his life. However, the ability consumes a lot of stamina, meaning he cannot maintain it for very long. If he ever faces something like a herd of wild boars again, pure speed alone will not solve the problem. Those animals are powerful and can easily follow a scent trail. What he really needs is enough strength to confront such threats head-on. Still, the option of boosting his physical strength also has limitations. The system description clearly states that the strength skill works best in one-on-one combat. If he ever encounters a large herd of wild boars again, landing a few powerful blows will hardly make a difference against so many dangerous animals. After thinking about it for a while, Shin reminds himself that he now possesses a newly crafted bamboo bow. With a reliable ranged weapon in his hands, he can compensate for his lack of raw physical strength and avoid direct confrontation whenever possible. In the end, the super speed skill still seems like the most practical choice for survival. After weighing the risks and benefits for a long time, Shin finally confirms the purchase of the Cheetah Speed skill. Immediately, the system responds with a congratulatory message, acknowledging the successful acquisition. Moments later, a mechanical voice echoes in his mind again. The system calmly announces that the physical transformation process has officially begun. Almost instantly, Shin begins to feel an unusual sensation spreading throughout his body. It feels as though a warm current of energy is flowing through every muscle and nerve. He senses that each cell in his body is filling with new strength, vitality, and incredible responsiveness. The following day, the 2 young survivors focus on restoring their camp after the unexpected night raid by the wild boars. Piece by piece, they try to repair the damage and bring their living space back into order. Unfortunately, the boars had caused serious destruction. Many of the tools and supplies the pair had carefully gathered were either broken or scattered beyond use. Seeing their ruined belongings reminds them just how fragile their survival setup truly is. However, the experience they gained earlier proves valuable. Using clay from the nearby ground, the young survivors begin crafting ceramic dishes again. Their skills have clearly improved, and within only 2 days they managed to produce a fresh set of basic cookware and household utensils. On the 3rd day after the heavy rainstorm, Shin finally finds some time to practice using his newly crafted bamboo bow. He heads into a quiet part of the forest to begin training. Since he has never used a bow like this before, his first attempts are far from impressive. Many of his arrows fly off course, and his accuracy leaves a lot to be desired. Still, Shin refuses to give up. After an entire day of constant practice, he slowly begins to improve. His shots are not perfect yet, but they are at least accurate enough that he could realistically hit something as large as a boar. Later, Shin walks deeper into the forest, moving carefully beneath the dense canopy of leaves overhead. The thick foliage blocks much of the sunlight. Even though the rain stopped 3 days ago, the soil under his feet remains damp and soft. As he continues exploring, the boy suddenly notices something strange growing nearby. Several unusual flowers sit low to the ground, and inside their cup-shaped petals, he can see tiny tadpoles swimming in collected water. The sight surprises him greatly. He wonders how those tiny creatures ended up inside the flowers. After thinking for a moment, he realizes that the tadpoles will eventually grow and transform into small frogs. Kin studies the flowers more closely and concludes that a frog must have laid its eggs there. Looking at the tiny ecosystem inside a single plant makes him reflect on how vast and mysterious this world really is. He never imagined that tadpoles could survive inside a flower. Even though Chin once encountered dangerous wild boars near the bamboo grove, he still decides to return to that area. The fresh bamboo shoots growing there are simply too valuable as a food source to ignore. While gathering shoots, a strange sound suddenly interrupts his work. The boy freezes instantly and listens carefully, trying to pinpoint where the sound is coming from. After focusing for a moment, he recognizes the sound. It most likely belongs to pheasants that inhabit this part of the forest. Following the noise quietly, Chin eventually reaches a small clearing in the bamboo grove. There he sees a large flock of pheasants wandering across the ground. He has never seen this particular species before, and he pauses briefly to admire their colorful feathers. Slowly and carefully, he raises his bow and draws the string back. A confident thought crosses his mind. Today's lunch might turn into a delicious pot of fresh pheasant soup. However, when he releases the arrow, it whistles past the bird without touching it. The pheasant continues running completely unharmed. In that moment, the guy suddenly realizes something important. Hitting a moving target is far more difficult than shooting at a stationary one. The pheasants seem surprisingly calm, even though arrows continue flying near them. They do not panic immediately, which gives him several chances to shoot again. Chin keeps firing arrow after arrow, but most of them miss their targets. Soon he realizes he has nearly exhausted his entire supply of arrows. Determined not to fail, he decides to move closer. Carefully approaching the birds, he draws the bowstring again. At this shorter distance, he feels confident that his next shot will land. This time Chin aims more carefully and releases the arrow at just the right moment. The projectile strikes a fast-moving pheasant successfully. Immediately, the system announces that he has earned 200 points for hunting a wild pheasant. Excitement begins to build inside Shin as he continues shooting at the birds. However, after a short while he realizes that he has completely run out of arrows. Fortunately, this does not bother him at all. He has already managed to bring down several birds, which should be more than enough to prepare a satisfying meal later. Leaving his hiding spot, Chin slowly walks toward the fallen birds, carefully collecting the pheasants he successfully hunted. Later at the camp, Chin smiles and asks the girl if she is ready to enjoy the special meal. With a playful tone, he tells her that he is about to lift the lid. The moment the lid is removed, the air fills with the rich and comforting aroma of freshly cooked soup. Helen's eyes light up instantly, and she admits that the smell alone already makes her incredibly happy. She gently blows across the steaming surface of the soup, cooling it slightly before taking a careful sip. Slowly, she begins tasting the broth, savoring every moment. After a moment, she smiles warmly and says that this pheasant soup is easily the best meal she has had in a very long time. Helen enjoys the experience deeply, appreciating the rich flavor of the pheasant meat as it spreads across her tongue. The meat blends beautifully with the fresh and slightly tangy taste of the young bamboo shoots they added to the soup. All these different flavors combine perfectly, almost dancing together across her taste buds. Pheasant meat is lean and contains very little fat. Although the birds are not very large, their clean and tender meat tastes incredibly satisfying. The guy sighs slightly and comments that it is a shame they do not have any salt. If they did, the flavor of the soup would become even more delicious. Helen nods enthusiastically in agreement. She laughs and says that if a little salt were added to this soup, the taste might be so good it would drive her crazy. She continues talking about how much they truly need salt. Not only would it improve the flavor of their meals, but it would also help their bodies maintain essential minerals necessary for proper health. Shin looks at her with clear surprise. He finds it slightly amusing that she calls herself a student, yet it never crossed her mind that salt can be easily extracted from seawater. With a confident tone, the guy tells her that tomorrow they will head to the beach. There, they can collect seawater and obtain enough salt to finally solve this problem. When the next morning arrives, Chin and Helen leave their camp together and begin walking toward the beach, ready to tackle their next small challenge. As they reach the shore, Helen points out that boiling seawater to collect salt will take quite a long time. She suggests that instead of waiting around, they should walk along the beach and search for anything useful. Chin nods, but says she can explore on her own for a while. Meanwhile, he plans to construct a simple sundial so they can track the time more accurately and organize their daily routine better. Helen looks confused by the idea. They barely have proper tools and cannot even build a stable house yet. Because of that, she struggles to understand how making something like a sundial is even possible. Ignoring the doubt, the guy begins working immediately. He gathers some clay from the ground, spreads it out carefully, and shapes it into a flat square layer that will serve as the base for his sundial. After preparing the ground carefully, he takes a length of rope and stretches it across the shape they created. With patient movements, he divides the regular quadrilateral by pulling the rope from one corner to another, tracing the diagonals. This simple method allows them to split the shape neatly into equal sections, creating a geometric guide that will help them construct a working timekeeping device without complicated tools. Next, he carefully draws a circle inside the shape they prepared. This circle will become the face of their sundial. As he explains, the circle will later be divided into several sectors, and each sector will represent a different period of the day. The position of the sun in the sky will determine how these sectors are arranged, allowing the dial to track time as the sunlight moves. He goes on to explain that there are actually three main types of sundials used throughout history: equatorial, vertical, and horizontal. Each of these designs works in a slightly different way and has its own unique features. Even though they all rely on sunlight and shadows, the angle and structure of the dial determine how accurately they measure time. The girl listens closely and quickly understands that the difference between these sundials mainly comes from how their angles are divided. In the case of equatorial sundials, the gnomon, the piece that casts the shadow, stands perfectly perpendicular to the dial's surface. Meanwhile, the dial itself is tilted at a specific angle so it aligns with the Earth's rotation. Among all sundial designs, equatorial sundials are especially interesting because the divisions on the dial are evenly spaced. Each hour mark is separated by exactly the same angle. This makes them stand out compared to other types of sundials, where the hour lines can be uneven depending on the orientation of the dial. Using only a rope as their main tool, they begin marking the hour lines on the dial's surface. Surprisingly, they don't need any complicated measuring devices. By relying on simple geometric principles and careful positioning, they manage to divide the circle into accurate time segments. This sundial design is slightly unusual compared to the typical ones people are familiar with. Instead of dividing the dial into the usual 12 sections, they create 24 divisions. This matches the fact that the sun completes a full 360-degree journey across the sky over 24 hours. Curious, the girl asks how they will manage to install the gnomon perfectly upright and how they can determine the correct tilt for the base without any special instruments. Shin calmly explains that they don't need to rely on complex navigation tools like a sextant. A sextant is designed to measure the angle between the sun and the horizon at a specific location, which is useful for navigation at sea. However, for building their sundial, such precise instruments are completely unnecessary. Instead, they will use a much simpler and more natural reference point. The key moment is noon, the time of day when the sun stands highest in the sky and shadows become the shortest. By identifying this exact moment, they can establish a reliable starting point that allows the sundial to measure time correctly. With everything prepared, the young pair now only has to wait patiently. They watch the bamboo stick carefully, observing the shadow it casts on the dial. Eventually, there will be a moment when the shadow nearly disappears beneath the stick itself. That brief instant will signal that noon has arrived. Meanwhile, the sea salt they collected earlier is still slightly damp from the evaporation process. Chin examines it closely and decides to stop heating it any further. If they continue applying heat, the salt might burn or become contaminated, which would make it useless for cooking. After thinking it over for a moment, He concludes that the best solution is the simplest one. Instead of forcing the drying process with heat, they will spread the salt out and let the sun dry it naturally. The warm sunlight and gentle breeze should remove the remaining moisture. Although the amount of salt they produced turned out to be quite impressive, the raw crystals are far from clean. The mixture still contains grains of sand, bits of dirt, and other small impurities collected during the evaporation process. Before it can be safely used for food, the salt will need to be cleaned carefully. He also realizes that once the cleaning process is finished, the amount of usable salt will shrink considerably. A large portion will be lost along with the impurities. Because of this, he decides to start another batch and sets another pot of seawater to evaporate. At that moment, Helen calls out excitedly. She points toward the sundial and announces that the shadow from the bamboo stick has completely disappeared. According to their calculations, that means the sun has reached its highest point. It's exactly noon. Using several small pieces of bamboo as supports, Chin carefully adjusts the position of the sundial. He ensures that the dial lies perfectly horizontal so that the measurements remain accurate. Even a slight tilt could throw off the shadow lines and ruin their time readings. Once the seawater finishes evaporating, a layer of rough salt crystals forms at the bottom of the container. However, this raw salt is not suitable for eating. It still contains dirt, sand, and other contaminants that could be harmful if consumed without further purification. Keeping this in mind, the two young survivors carry the salt back to their camp. Their next task is clear. They must filter and purify it properly so that it becomes safe enough to use in cooking and preserving food. The first step of the cleaning process is simple but important. The raw salt must be rinsed thoroughly in clean water. This washing helps remove larger impurities such as sand grains and visible dirt that cling to the crystals. Chin explains that purification is the most critical stage in salt production. Without proper filtration, the salt will remain unsafe to eat. To solve this problem, he decides to build a homemade filtering device using the materials available around them. Inside a hollow bamboo container, he carefully arranges several filtering layers. First, he adds small pebbles, then coarse sand, followed by fine sand, and finally pieces of charcoal. These layers work together to trap dirt and purify the liquid that passes through. He mentions that if they had access to activated charcoal instead of ordinary charcoal, the filtration process would be even more effective. Activated carbon is known for absorbing impurities extremely well, which would allow them to produce cleaner and higher quality salt. Unfortunately, the homemade filtration system works very slowly. The water trickles through the layers drop by drop, which means the entire purification process takes a long time. With no way to speed it up, they simply have to wait patiently. Later that day, the sundial they carried back to camp indicates that the time has reached 6 in the evening. The shadow stretches long across the dial, confirming that the sun is beginning to set. During dinner, Helen happily declares that the pheasant soup they prepared tastes incredible. She smiles with genuine delight, saying that the flavor is far better than she expected given their simple cooking conditions. Chin reminds her that Chinese cuisine is famous for its wide range of seasonings, spices, and cooking techniques. Yet despite all those ingredients, one element stands above the rest. Salt, he explains, is the most essential seasoning in almost every dish. Helen nods in agreement right away. She says that even the smallest pinch of salt can transform a dish completely. It enhances the natural flavors of the ingredients, making the food taste richer, fuller, and much more satisfying. As they sit together by the fire, the girl suddenly begins counting the days they have spent on the island. To her surprise, she realizes that nearly an entire month has passed since they arrived. The time seems to have slipped by almost unnoticed. She reminds Chin about his earlier idea of building a boat so they can eventually leave the island. Curious, she asks what type of boat he plans to construct. Chin replies that crossing the sea safely would require something at least as sturdy as a proper fishing boat. However, before attempting that, they must first improve their living conditions. Helen suggests that their next project should be strengthening their shelter. Instead of relying on their temporary structure, they could build a stronger bamboo or wooden house. A solid shelter would protect them better, especially if wild animals decide to wander close to their camp again. Chin agrees with her reasoning. He recalls the recent storm when heavy rain poured through their simple wooden shed. Living under such a fragile structure clearly isn't safe in the long run, so searching for a better housing solution makes perfect sense. With that decision made, Chin begins looking for a completely new campsite. They have already secured a steady food supply and organized their daily tasks. Now seems like the perfect moment to relocate somewhere safer and more comfortable. For 4 days straight, he explores the surrounding areas in search of the ideal location. Despite covering a lot of ground, none of the places he finds seems suitable enough to serve as their permanent camp. On the 5th morning, Chin finally steps into a wide open clearing filled with bright sunlight. The space feels different from the places he has seen before, and he begins to hope that he might have finally discovered the perfect site for their new camp. As he studies the area more closely, he notices several advantages. The clearing is separated from the dense forest, giving it a clear and open view. It is also spacious enough to build structures and organize supplies, making it a promising location. While examining the surroundings further, Chin spots a large rock formation nearby. Inside the rock is a sizable cave, and its dark entrance immediately catches his attention. However, the discovery also makes him cautious. A cave of that size could easily be home to a wild animal. Before considering it as a shelter, he decides that he must first make sure the cave is empty and safe. To test it, he carefully fires an arrow into the cave's entrance. The arrow flies inside and strikes the stone wall with a sharp sound that echoes from within. Since no creature rushes out in response, Chin begins to think that the cave might actually be empty after all. He starts imagining how useful the cave could be as a shelter. It looks large enough to live in comfortably, and if the interior stays dry during rain, it could serve as a natural house. Just as he considers this possibility, a sudden loud crunch interrupts his thoughts. Looking down at the ground near his feet, Chin notices something disturbing. Scattered across the floor are numerous bones of different animals. The sight makes it clear that this cave already belongs to a predator, and judging by the size of the bones, it must be a large one. At that exact moment, he feels a rush of air behind him. His instincts kick in, and he quickly leaps aside, narrowly avoiding a powerful strike that could have been fatal. A massive bear swings its heavy paw toward his head. The attack is incredibly fast and strong. Chin reacts instantly, dodging the blow and activating a special ability known as Cheetah Speed, which dramatically boosts his movement. With that burst of speed, he manages to retreat several meters away in a split second. Only then does he get a proper look at the creature and realize that the cave is the home of a giant panda. The enormous animal charges after him, attempting to close the distance. However, Chin's enhanced speed allows him to stay just out of reach, keeping himself barely ahead of the furious predator. Thinking quickly, Chin decides to distract the animal. He grabs a bamboo bottle and throws it toward the panda, hoping the unexpected object will confuse it long enough for him to escape. The trick actually works. The panda suddenly stops chasing him and turns its attention to the strange bamboo object lying on the ground. Curious, the huge animal picks up the bottle and bites down on it with its powerful jaws, testing the unfamiliar item. Then the panda rises onto its hind legs, lifting its front paws high into the air. It releases a deep, thunderous roar that echoes through the clearing. As the predator prepares to attack again, Chin quickly realizes that fighting such a massive beast head-on would be extremely dangerous. The only sensible option now is to create as much distance as possible before planning his next move. The giant panda suddenly rushes into the nearby forest, pushing through the bushes where Chin is quietly hiding among the trees. The animal moves with surprising power, its heavy body rustling leaves and branches. It repeatedly turns its head from side to side, scanning the forest carefully, clearly trying to locate the young man who had dared to challenge its territory. Hidden behind the thick trunk of a tree, Chin slowly pulls back the string of his bow and steadies his breathing. As he watches the panda searching for him, he quietly realizes something interesting. Compared to wild boars he had encountered before, this panda's sense of smell seems much weaker, because despite being so close, it still hasn't managed to detect him by scent. Chin keeps perfectly still, barely daring to breathe. To his surprise, the massive panda walks even closer and stops near the very tree where he is hiding. The animal sniffs the air lazily, but it clearly hasn't sensed his presence yet. Watching this from above, Qin feels both relieved and tense at the same time. The young man feels conflicted. He never imagined he would have to kill a panda, an animal often considered gentle and even sacred. But the situation leaves him little choice if he wants to claim the cave as a safe shelter. Taking a deep breath, he silently apologizes to the creature in his heart before releasing the arrow, hoping this single shot will settle the matter quickly. The arrow flies straight and strikes the panda squarely in the back. However, instead of collapsing, the animal barely reacts. Its incredibly thick skin and dense fur absorb most of the impact, leaving the arrow lodged harmlessly without causing any real damage. Realizing instantly that wooden arrows won't be enough to stop such a powerful animal, Qin changes his plan. Without hesitation, he leaps down from the tree and activates his cheetah speed skill. In the blink of an eye, he darts away from the panda, quickly creating distance while observing how the beast struggles to keep up. This time Qin switches to a stronger weapon, a stone-tipped arrow designed to pierce tougher targets. Drawing his bow carefully, he releases the shot. The arrow flies forward and strikes the panda in the head. The animal immediately rises onto its hind legs and lets out a thunderous roar, clearly furious and in pain. Despite landing a much stronger hit, the stone-tipped arrow still fails to cause serious damage. Instead of weakening the panda, the attack only enrages it further. The creature's eyes blaze with anger as it prepares to retaliate. Within seconds, the panda locks onto Qin's position. With surprising speed for such a large animal, it charges toward him and begins striking wildly with its massive paws, each swing powerful enough to crush bones if it lands. While dodging the brutal attacks, Qin silently thanks the mysterious system that granted him the cheetah speed ability. He understands very clearly that without this skill, even a single blow from the panda would likely have broken his body in half. Eventually, the effect of the cheetah's speed skill fades, forcing Qin to retreat back to camp. When he explains the situation, Helen suggests that maybe they should just leave the cave alone and search for another place to live. After all, pandas are considered national treasures, and clearly this one is extremely difficult to defeat. Qin listens carefully, but shares his doubts. The panda he encountered looked very unusual compared to the pandas people normally know. Its size, behavior, and strength seemed different, which makes him suspect it might not actually be an ordinary panda at all. Trying to calm Helen's worries, Qin reassures her that he won't act recklessly. He promises that he will only take action if he feels confident about the outcome. And even if things go wrong, he can always rely on his speed skill to escape from the panda safely. Qin then comes up with a new plan. He decides to create metal arrowheads using the iron from his belt buckle. Since the material is limited, he will only be able to make 2 arrows. To avoid losing them after shooting, he plans to tie a rope to each arrow so he can pull them back afterward. However, melting iron is not easy. Iron typically begins to melt at temperatures close to 1,500 degrees Celsius. Unfortunately, an ordinary wood fire can only reach about 700 degrees, which means it is impossible to melt iron using a simple campfire alone. To solve this problem, Qin decides to construct an air pump that will continuously push air into the furnace. By feeding oxygen directly into the flames, the fire will burn hotter and stronger, allowing the temperature to rise high enough to melt the metal. The basic principle behind an air pump is actually quite simple. It works by repeatedly drawing in air and then pushing it out under pressure, forcing more oxygen into the fire to intensify the combustion. The device Qin plans to build functions somewhat like a large syringe. By pumping air directly into the firebox while the fire burns, it dramatically increases the efficiency of the flames and raises the overall temperature inside the furnace. After spending some time gathering materials, Qin finally manages to assemble a basic blower using clay and pieces of bamboo. Although the design is simple, it should be powerful enough to provide the airflow needed for metal smelting. The mechanism itself is very straightforward. It consists of a simple outer casing and a rotating axis fitted with several blades. Even though it looks primitive, the design is effective and doesn't require any complicated tools or rare materials. While Qin focuses on building and adjusting the blower, Helen takes on another important task. She begins shaping small clay molds that will later be used to form the metal arrowheads once the iron melts. As she works with the clay, Helen occasionally glances over at Chin, removing the metal buckle from his belt. She can't help but think that if he keeps turning their belongings into tools, they might soon end up with barely any clothes left to wear. Hearing her comment, Chin laughs and teasingly tells her that she's worrying too much. He jokingly says she must think too highly of herself if she believes he would sacrifice all their clothing just for equipment. Soon everything is ready for the smelting process. The two of them ignite the large clay furnace they built, feeding it with wood while preparing to melt the iron and create the arrowheads they need. They take turns spinning the handle that powers the homemade blower. After working for a long time, Helen finally groans in exhaustion and says she no longer has the strength left to keep turning the mechanism. Chin quickly encourages her to hold on just a little longer. He explains that the temperature inside the furnace is finally high enough, and the iron has already begun to soften. If they stop now, all their effort will be wasted. But Helen has truly reached her limit. With a tired sigh, she lets go of the handle and collapses onto the ground, completely drained from the intense effort. Meanwhile, Chin carefully inspects the clay molds Helen prepared earlier. He is genuinely impressed by how neat and precise they are. The shapes are detailed and symmetrical, far better than he expected. Using only a small knife and her hands, Helen managed to carve perfectly balanced molds. Chin looks at them with admiration and jokingly tells her that from now on he might have to rely on her craftsmanship more often. At last, the metal arrowheads are successfully formed inside the molds. With the casting finished, the only remaining step is to carefully sharpen the tips until they become deadly precise weapons. After examining the finished arrowheads, Chin smiles with satisfaction. He tells Helen that the results look excellent and promises that tonight he will cook a special dinner to thank her for all the hard work she contributed. At that moment, the system suddenly appears with a notification. It informs Chin that he has earned 1,000 points for successfully crafting metal arrowheads, which immediately lifts his mood. While continuing to sharpen the arrowheads, Chin accidentally slips and cuts his finger slightly. Looking at the blade's sharp edge, he nods and decides that the arrowheads are now more than sharp enough for battle. Still, Chin can't help but feel a bit disappointed. They only had enough iron to make 2 arrows. If he had a dozen metal arrows and combined them with his speed ability, he is confident he could defeat the giant panda without much trouble. Soon the system issues another reward notification. For building the sundial and producing salt earlier, Chin receives an additional 4,700 points, greatly increasing the balance in his account. Seeing his points rise, Chin begins thinking about making a purchase in the system's virtual store. After browsing through the options, he decides that the Wild Animal Encyclopedia pack could be extremely useful. Just then, another prompt appears offering a special deal. The system suggests purchasing the encyclopedia together with a wild animal training pack at a discounted price of 4,500 points. After considering it for only a moment, Chin decides the offer is too good to ignore. He accepts immediately, and the information begins downloading directly into his mind. Curious about what he just purchased, Chin starts reviewing the contents of the wild animal training pack, especially the bonus materials that came with it. The data contains descriptions of various combat techniques designed for dealing with dangerous animals. According to the system, mastering these techniques could allow someone to defeat wild beasts and dominate the natural world. The first demonstration begins with a kangaroo skilled in close combat. The instructions explain that when a kangaroo leans back on its tail and prepares to kick with both powerful hind legs, that moment creates a brief opening. At that exact instant, you must dive carefully beneath the animal's body. Once you are positioned under the kangaroo, the guide advises striking its most vulnerable area, the groin, with your hands as quickly as possible. Supposedly, this will immediately incapacitate the animal. The training guide then moves on to hippopotamuses, explaining that these massive creatures possess enormous bodies and powerful jaws. Facing one directly in combat would almost certainly end badly for a human. Instead, the instructions recommend distracting the hippopotamus and moving quickly behind it. Before the animal realizes what is happening, you should dive underneath its large body. Once underneath the hippopotamus, the guide suggests delivering a powerful kick to its groin with as much force as possible. According to the system's bizarre advice, this attack will cause the hippopotamus overwhelming pain, forcing it to collapse helplessly. Continuing the assault will eventually subdue the creature completely. Next, the training manual discusses gorillas. These primates are among the strongest animals in the wild, possessing immense muscle strength and devastating punches. Despite this, the guide claims they are still manageable under the right conditions. The first step, according to the instructions, is to provoke the gorilla until it becomes angry and loses its calm focus. Once the gorilla is sufficiently distracted, the guide strangely suggests diving beneath its body and pointing an AK-47 assault rifle directly at it. Finally, the system concludes that explosive bullets will quickly finish the job, ensuring the gorilla is defeated without further struggle. After reading through the strange instructions in the training pack, Chin is left completely stunned. He stares at the information for several seconds, unable to believe what he just read. The advice sounds so ridiculous that he wonders who on earth could have written something so absurd. In his frustration, he even mutters that the person responsible for this nonsense should be punished for spreading such outrageous guidance. The disappointment hits him hard. Chin realizes that he spent a huge amount of valuable system points on information that turned out to be mostly useless. The more he thinks about it, the more irritated he becomes, convinced that the so-called training guide is nothing more than a pile of nonsense. The next morning arrives quietly. Helen slowly crawls out of the tent, still half asleep, rubbing her eyes and stretching her arms lazily. Chin greets her with a friendly smile and tells her good morning, adding that he has already prepared a pot of hot soup for breakfast. As they eat, Helen begins wondering aloud just how big and dangerous that panda really is. Chin immediately becomes serious when he hears this. With a firm tone, he warns her not to even think about going near the cave, making it clear that the place is far too dangerous. Deep down, Chin understands a harsh truth. If something goes wrong during another encounter with the panda, he might barely manage to escape by himself. But if Helen were with him during such a moment, the situation could easily become deadly for both of them. Helen, however, shifts the conversation by praising his cooking, happily telling him that his morning soup tastes wonderful and that his cooking skills seem to improve every single day. Later, Chin quietly approaches the panda's cave once again. As he moves carefully through the forest, he reminds himself that he only has 2 metal arrows. To avoid losing them if a shot misses, he tightly ties ropes to the arrows so he can retrieve them afterward. Before using the precious metal arrows, Chin decides to test the cave first. He plans to shoot a simple wooden arrow inside to check whether the panda is currently hiding there or not. The arrow flies into the cave and disappears into the darkness. For several seconds, nothing happens. Hearing no movement or reaction, Chin concludes that the cave is probably empty. He guesses that the panda must have gone deeper into the forest to search for food. Instead of entering the cave immediately, Chin chooses a safer strategy. He climbs into a good hidden position nearby and prepares to watch the area patiently, planning to ambush the panda when it eventually returns. Since he has some time to wait, Chin decides to open the system encyclopedia and study it more carefully. He hopes that learning more about pandas might reveal useful information about their habits, weaknesses, or behavior. However, his research doesn't last long. Just a few minutes later, he notices a massive shape slowly approaching the cave from the forest, forcing him to focus all his attention on the incoming animal. At the same time, the virtual system begins displaying background information. It explains that pandas first appeared during the late Miocene period roughly 8 million years ago, and their early ancestors were predators that lived in dense, humid forests. Chin is amazed by how ancient this species really is. The idea that such creatures have existed for millions of years without changing much fills him with a strange sense of respect for their resilience.